as time goes by. But you know, I do think that there's an enormous consensus, and that this case has become incredibly embarrassing to all those involved, and the only ones who really call for Julian's imprisonment or extradition are people who are implicated in the crimes and illegality and corruption that he exposed. They're basically not disinterested parties, and it's pretty obvious. You'd be hard-pressed to find someone who's not one of those people calling for Julian's imprisonment to continue.
And John, you've had a busy year since we last met. Could you tell us a little bit of what you've been doing?
Well, Gabriel and I went to the United States and did 60 events with Ithaca at 9 universities and 42 cities in 47 days. So it was sort of busy, as you can imagine. And then we ended up in Mexico with President Obrador. I found working around the world, actually in the conversation with President Obrador, we both took, he may be copied from me, we both took a similar view that there is in every human heart a yearning to see justice done and a revulsion at injustice. And that's obvious in the case of Julian Assange. Every president in the Latin American theatre, every single one of them, objects to the treatment of Julian. We just had yesterday and the day before Rome and Naples making Julian honorary citizens. Every single parliament, with the exception of Sweden, has an Assange group in it. Some, like Greece, of 300 parliamentarians, 90 are in the Assange group. Or in the case of Australia, now the Prime Minister, the opposition leader, the entire polity and 88% of the population demand that Julian be returned home. It's now a matter between an alliance, an alliance matter between the Australian government and the White House, that this matter be solved. A delegation from Australia went to Washington just a couple of weeks ago and was well received, a delegation of parliamentarians. The same will happen, we hope, from France, who are very enthusiastic supporters of Julian Assange. That said, there's a tremendous tension, unimaginable tension, that draws two poles outwards from each other in Julian's matter. One is the ceaseless, malicious hounding, the unscrupulous lies, the most unscrupulous lies you can imagine over a period of 14 years, one after the other. Malicious court cases which fail in due process and make an example of the United Kingdom court process of what not to do in the pursuit of legal administration or lawful administration. So you have that 14 years of ceaseless malice developed to the door of Julian Assange. Entire institutions pursuing him. One man in a cell by himself. The Department of Justice, the Department of State, the Crown Prosecuting Service, the Swedish Prosecuting Authority, the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade in Australia. It's extraordinary. And on the other side, pulling the other way, is the benefits of those revelations that Julian and WikiLeaks published. The benefits, I'll outline 3 rather quickly. 1, justice. The Guantanamo Bay files allowed 2 lawyers, Stephen, I've forgotten his other name, and Clive Stafford Smith, one is Australian, Stephen, and Clive Stafford Smith is an American resident in the UK, to free prisoners locked up in Guantanamo Bay. The Guantanamo Bay files enabled that, to bring justice to some people poorly done by. Next, bring an end to war. Can you imagine one cable in the 250,000 cables in the cable set, just one of those 250,000? Many of them have had the same results, but I'll just outline one for you. In 2006, a group of American soldiers broke into a house outside Baghdad, handcuffed the 5 occupants of the house, 11 occupants of the house, 5 of them being children, and then murdered them. To escape from this crime, they called in an airstrike to obliterate all sight of that family from the earth. It partially succeeded, but only partially. As a consequence of that, a report was written. That report went to the United States Embassy in Baghdad. From there, it went to the Department of Justice. Some years later, 2010, it was released by Chelsea Manning and published in its entirety by WikiLeaks. The Parliament of Iraq, that ruined country that had had the foul benefit, the vile benefit of shock and awe, where war was declared on the citizenry, 26 of their 28 water purification plants destroyed. Mothers can't give their children a glass of water for fear of dysentery. That wrecked up nation gathered together its courage in a most amazing moment and said, we're not signing the Status of Forces Agreement. You can take your troops and go. A magnificent moment. They said, take your troops and leave this country. One cable out of 250,000, all of those cables bringing benefit to someone somewhere. One cable brought an end to a war. Can you imagine anything so magnificent? So you see the tremendous tension, unimaginable stress between this pole, the persecution, the malicious persecution of Julian Assange, and on this pole, bringing an end to a war. Thank you.
John, thank you very much. Gabriel, I think in our discussions earlier, I mean, you were very careful and very interestingly pointed out that actually within America, some of your advocate supporters are not only left-wing Congress members, but are actually Republican Party. In other words, I mean, this is not an issue which defines neatly into left-right politics, but actually straddles, what is normally, diverse opinions. Can you explain a little bit about that and which you found out on your recent trip, and I believe you're going next week as well?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, a lot of people think that this case is, homogenous in the United States, but it's actually seen as extremely controversial within the United States. You've got all the major human rights and press freedom NGOs in the US, such as the ACLU, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty, have all written multiple letters to the Garland Department of Justice. That's the Department of Justice who are pushing the National Security Department, calling on them to drop these charges because of the threat that they pose to press freedom and the First Amendment in the US. You also have the New York Times, who wrote a letter to the Garland Department of Justice just a little under a year ago, calling on them to drop this case against Julian because of the threat it poses to press freedom and the First Amendment. And so you have all these institutions, corporate media in the US, who are all talking out against this case. And also that has flowed into the Congress, where we've seen more and more Democrats. There was a letter by seven or eight progressive Democrats to the Garland Department of Justice, again calling on them to drop the charges, but also on the other side, the Republican side, and that shows that it's a matter of principle, and that there is an understanding now that it's a threat to the First Amendment, that it's really an attack on what is the sort of premier press freedom of speech law around the world, that this is an attempt by the national security establishment to turn the First Amendment into more of a walled garden, to say, you can have it, but you can't, use it for reporting on national security or NDI type of information. And so that's why we've seen this sort of, more and more of this campaign growing across the US. And John mentioned just last month, I was there with 6 politicians from Australia across the political spectrum again. So you have, far left, far right, as well as centre politicians, 6 of them, all travelled to Washington to advocate for Julian's freedom. And they met with Republicans. They met with people like Marjorie Taylor Greene, who is what we call a mugger type Republican, as well as more centrist Republicans like Rand Paul, who's from the libertarian bent, as well as people like Jim McGovern, who's a progressive Democrat. And I think that just shows that this issue affects everybody equally, and their right to know what governments do in their name is, that really important aspect of democracy that these politicians all see as under threat.
I think that's a very, very interesting point. Stella, you're an experienced lawyer as well. I mean, as well as obviously it's an affair of heart and family. Part of you comes from this as a lawyer. I mean, what do you bring to that? I mean, what do you think the key legal aspects of this case are? I mean, is it what Gabriel says, or do you think there are any added points you would want to bring to it?
Well, this case is a real departure from what there has been before, from the protections of press freedom and freedom of speech that had been pretty robust in the previous, say, 60 years. But then with the coming of age of the internet, this brought in a kind of a communications revolution through which anyone could basically publish or reach potentially the entire internet-connected population. And of course, this brings with it a game-changing element, because if you think about how the printed press worked, you needed to have access, physical access to the readers, and now you had information could truly be free at a very low cost. basically no cost. And so this became a real challenge to those who saw themselves as the gatekeepers of information, and those in power who were threatened by the free flow of information. And so these protections that had existed for, I'm using 60 years basically from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the various conventions that came after, like the ICCPR and so on, that's when those protections were really put to the test. And with Julian's case, obviously there was a political, financial, reputational attacks, but the legal attacks really came with the Trump administration in 2018, because Julian's indictment is from 2018, in a climate that was significantly different to the one that WikiLeaks, of the one when WikiLeaks actually published these things, which was in 2010, 2011. The Afghan war logs, Iraq, diplomatic cables, Guantanamo Bay, and the rules of engagement. These are the 5 publications that Julian is facing extradition and Espionage Act charges and 175 years in relation to. They were published in 2010. And I think this 2010-2011 is really the height of freedom of the press in the world. With these publications, that was when the internet was at its freest, when the press was at its bravest. And then the attacks came against Julian, and Julian being the most visible representative of freedom of speech and freedom of the press. It sent a signal, initially, blocking donations, PayPal, MasterCard, Visa, Bank of America, and so on, blocking all the donations to WikiLeaks. As soon as WikiLeaks had published the diplomatic cables in a completely extra-legal manner, it was basically a phone call from a couple of U.S. lawmakers to their contacts in these in MasterCard and Bank of America and so on, and then there was no declaration. They just cut off the donation flow. This is the first time it was ever done, and it was a big controversy at the time, but except for an Icelandic court, it was basically able to continue, and that forced WikiLeaks to eventually, once it had run out of funds, accept donations via Bitcoin early on. And it was thanks to the Bitcoin donations and the Bitcoin community that WikiLeaks was able to survive that financial shutdown. So there was financial, political, reputational attacks. But by the time the indictment came in 2018, the press, the freedom of the press environment had severely deteriorated. So much so that it was possible to take an Espionage Act case against Julian, not because it was legally sound, but because it was politically possible, because they could get away with it, because the Trump administration was motivated to bring a case against a publisher that would set a precedent against the rest of the press, because Julian was attacked in the UK through the mainstream media, including by the mainstream media, and there was an undermining of his political support, so much so that by the time the indictment came and he was arrested, there had been a deliberate campaign mounted against him, and really intense campaign against Julian that set the ground for his arrest. So I see basically the legal deterioration follows a political deterioration. The will to shut down journalists is always there. But now there's many more means to do so, and of course Julian's indictment is the legal precedent. It has an extraterritorial aspect to it. Julian is Australian, he's not in the United States, he was publishing from Europe. So it has this kind of not just expansive, but universal. Basically, the United States is declaring itself to have universal jurisdiction over the press globally, and this is a extremist and really unhinged legal attack.
It's interesting what you say, because you're not only saying that press freedoms come and go, as they do and have done for hundreds of years, but you're kind of saying, well, actually it's undermining the post-war settlement here of rule-based governance with international agreements. And I think Gabriel also said, actually this is fundamental to the US Constitution here, you know, First Amendment stuff. Again, you know, it's very much, I don't see this as being a political battle as much more actually it's one of, you know, the institutions and the freedoms which came post 1945 for many countries and subsequent to that as well. And I think you raise those points very well. I'll come quickly back to Gabriel and then I'll come to you, John. Don't worry. Gabriel, this time last year we were speaking and your documentary was just being released, wasn't it? How's that been going?
Yeah, it's been very well received all over the world essentially. But it's a lot of, Stella alluded to this before, but Julian and WikiLeaks have come under, they were under 10 years of essential attacks in the media, this dehumanisation of Julian, on lots of different levels. And there was a lot of the work that we do, that the campaign does, is sort of changing the narrative really around this case, and changing the narrative from what people understood through this demonisation process and this weaponisation of the media, the corporate media mostly, against Julian, and sort of unwinding that, unpicking that, and getting down to what's really at stake for people, and also humanising Julian. And that's what we attempted to do with Ithaca, which is the documentary about John and Stella and their fight to free him, was humanise this man. He's a father, he's a son. He's not just a symbol for press freedoms or for democratic freedoms. He's also a human being who is surviving under immense amount of pressure in this maximum security cell. So the film is, it's been a bit of a game changer in that sense, in that it was put on public television in Australia as well as the United Kingdom. John and I toured with the film all around the United States. John mentioned before, we did 60 screenings in many different locations, 40-something cities. We went to red areas, blue areas. We were in New Hampshire. We did a screening, and people brought guns with them to the film screening, which I'd never experienced before. People sitting to watch a movie with a pistol at their side, made us a bit nervous for the Q&A afterwards. I think that was the best Q&A that we ever did, actually. But Yeah, it was really interesting and I think impactful tour, and just to get out into these areas where you wouldn't go otherwise. You know, like we went to places like Nebraska where we'd do a theatre full of mugger mums with their Trump hats on, and then we'd go to New York where it was, you know, very much a deep left crowd. Somebody mentioned Ronald Reagan in one of our screenings, and that led to almost a fight inside the theatre. Ronald Reagan's a Republican president, if anyone doesn't know, but it was very interesting to get in front of those people and just really work on changing that narrative about Julian and educating people about what's at stake. So it was really, it's been really a great tool in that sense, as well as it's been getting great reviews, gets awards and things like that. So as well as a piece of work, it's a great campaigning tool as well.
I have one more question for John, and then Eleanor, do we have a microphone for Q&A? I would like to bring the audience in to ask questions. Yeah, I can see microphones at the back. So perhaps if I just ask John a question, and then we'll open it up to the floor. John, you're a very thoughtful man. I mean, I've gained this from our previous meeting and also today. You clearly, all of you, think very carefully. What do you know now? What is one thing you know now which you didn't know 5 years ago? What has the process perhaps taught you?
Three things. But one of them I haven't mentioned before. The nature of power. Really don't want to know that, but have to learn it. The understanding that the genius of a people ascends from the people. It doesn't come down from the sky like rain. The genius of a nation ascends from within us as a community. Or to put it in a more Italian way, the genius of a people emerges from the loins of the men and women that constitute the society and ascends into government. And the third aspect is that we had Julian here, and in tremendous tension, the benefits of the revelations of Julian and Chelsea. And the third aspect is that it looks as though we are contending with the government. Okay, so there's the revelations which point out that the governments have gone off the track and started to embark upon power adventures. But the revelations actually assist us to pursue policy options or policy ideas or formulate policy and insist that the governments make their adjustments. That's one aspect. The other aspect of that statement is that often in an institution, it has its own ideology, it doesn't have feelings. But the people within the institution do have feelings. And those feelings often can be addressed by a leak or a revelation. That an institution that's wandered off the track will have many members in it that wish things were better, that could be repaired, could be renewed, new policies, reform, different direction, more contribution from the people. And this is the other aspect when journalists of integrity and moral virtue print these revelations. They assist in the renewal of government and actuate the elevation or ascendance of the genius of the people into policy government or policy execution. really important. I hope those ideas aren't too boring, you know, can get rattled on a bit, but I just want to understand that the essence, the absolute essence of everything is to understand, clearly understand, formulate it in your soul and thoughts, that the genius of a people arises from within the people, from within us, and it arises into the institutions of state. So never, ever despair. Thanks.
I think, in short, very, very much an advocate for civil society informing the state and not the other way around. Okay. Eleanor, I see you over the back with a roving microphone. Please, I would like to hear from the audience. Gentlemen there, please. Anyone else, please put your hands up and we will get you. Please, introduce yourself and ask questions.
I am Carlo Aman from Helvetica Ticino in Lugano. I would like to ask you, based on what facts is the British government holding Assange for 14 years? What has he done to the British to keep it in prison without any tribunal saying so? Thank you.
Well, I think, you know, I mean, what did Julian do? You know, been made, as Stella said earlier, he's been made an example of, and the British are almost more than equal partners in his persecution. In that, you know, the prosecution emanates from the United States, but the punishment is dealt out by the British. So they're working in partnership to make an example of Julian, to send that message to everybody around the world that if you use this publishing tool of the internet, or if you publish this sort of information or encourage leaking, that this is what is going to happen to you. And so the British are partners with the United States in setting this example. It's their system that's being used to do it. But maybe Stella or someone else might want to add something.
Well, Julian really, with WikiLeaks, WikiLeaks found a formula to really have a major impact on the debate around the Iraq and Afghan wars. A type of debate at a level that had not been had at all, because immediately when the war started, there was obviously protests around the world, but they still invaded. And then after a few years, there was just a lack of effective, you couldn't break through, really. It wasn't even a question about debate. All the information about the wars were being laundered through the PR departments of the Pentagon and so on. And so when WikiLeaks published these war diaries of both Iraq and Afghanistan, it gave a high-resolution history and of this conflict. Every single recorded death, every single recorded injury, where, when, who, etc. All this was compiled and brought before the public and analyzed, and individual stories were able to be told, and this created a whole new debate around the what was the end game in these wars. And of course, as John said, well, the U.S. military withdrew by December 2011 because of this cable, because they weren't able to renegotiate a immunity for U.S. forces in Iraq. And in Afghanistan, well, everyone knows how that went. They continued for another 10 years, but it was an utter disaster. And it was already clear in 2010 that it was an utter disaster and that there was no end game. So this is a real problem for the security war industries, right, which are incredibly kind of integrated into both the US and the UK state interests. And I mean, you think of these as individual states, but really they're part of this alliance called the Five Eyes Alliance. Australia, New Zealand, Canada, the United States, and the UK are part of this alliance. It's a security intelligence alliance, and it kind of floats above the democratic process. There is no real oversight. Their policies and their interests are discussed internally among these 5 nations, but without outside of the democratic parliamentary process. Even, you know, it is even so secret that the cabinet itself of these individual countries doesn't have a clear understanding of what these 5 countries are up to. So I think it's important to understand Julian's treatment through that prism, that there's within each of these states, yes, there is a security intelligence sector that wants to shut Julian down, that wants him imprisoned for the rest of his life. That is where, this is the Espionage Act charges, and the 175 years is an expression of that pocket within the US, the UK, you know, Australia. Well, Australia's might be different, but that logic comes from there. But it's not the only part of the state that has a say in Julian's fate. And there, as Gabriel was saying earlier, Julian's prosecution is very controversial, even within the administration, even within the Department of Justice. And it has been from the beginning throughout all the administrations. So the Obama administration decided not to prosecute Julian in relation to the Chelsea Manning leaks because they said there's no way to do this without setting a precedent for the rest of the press. He's a publisher, not a hacker. This administration is not prepared to criminalize journalism. The Trump administration was prepared to criminalize journalism, so they went ahead and did it. But even within the Trump administration, there were Department of Justice prosecutors who were working on the case, who then got taken off the case when Julian was indicted under the Espionage Act because they disagreed. So even within the US administration, because it is such a clear attack on the Constitution, and it changes the relationship between the citizen and the state. So the UK's role, I mean, the UK has a subservient role to the United States pretty much always, and you get this not just from like, you know, a public cynicism around power. You get it from the people in power themselves. I mean, I have spoken to people, to members of parliament from the governing party, and they have the same view, that the UK folds when there is a will coming from the United States. The role of the UK courts in this, well, I mean, Julian shouldn't have been imprisoned in the first place. And there's a lot that could be said about how the British courts have failed to enforce Julian's rights and so on. But I think you always have to look at it through this backdrop of there's an enormous political pressure in the United Kingdom to punish Julian. And the media for many years went along with that to really attack him. And there wasn't enough pushback, which is what has led to his imprisonment.
Lady here, you're... Got a There's a microphone here.
Thank you very much to the Assange family to be here. Thank you, really, thank you very much. And now I prefer to speak in Italian because I want
Okay, I'll translate. Yeah.
Oh, thank you.
Okay.
So, volevo dire che una cosa così bella e così importante come quella che avete organizzato con la famiglia Assange.
Very timely, very welcome, very important.
Noi siamo in Svizzera e in Svizzera ci sono 4 lingue: italiano, francese, tedesco e romancio. Non tutti, credo, possono seguire molto bene in un inglese così questo meraviglioso convegno.
We're in Switzerland. Switzerland is a federation of 4 languages, so it makes it difficult for all of us to follow in English. We're in the Italian-speaking part, obviously.
Per questo motivo sarebbe stato bello per tutti, io credo, avere una translation, qualcuno che potesse trasmettere a tutti.
I think we're learning next time. Maybe we'll try and get a translation
Thank you very much.
into Italian. Maybe.
Thank you.
Okay.
Can I bring, there is a person.
You have a question, and then we have here as well.
Just a very brief question.
Oh, right. Okay. Thank you. Anyway.
We had a TV transmission on Julian's case at a local TV, Chiasso TV, with the people from the Como for Assange group. And 2 main things came about during this transmission. One was the fact that most journalists right now are mouthpieces rather than real journalists, and then that Julian is paying for being a real journalist who did what every journalist does. And the second thing was our dismay at noticing how lots of people don't really realize that the Assange case is not about Julian Assange and that's it. It's about everyone, because it's an attack not only on press freedom, but also on individual personal freedom. And I had a feeling that some people who were very passive up to this point are having some sort of awakening now because of Julian, that maybe they are starting to realize that perhaps this is some sort of thing that is touching me personally, so maybe I should do something about it. Do you think that this might be, like Mr. Shipton said, an occasion, for people to finally take action, even when they're not apparently touched personally by what is happening? Thank you.
Does anyone want to come back on? Yeah.
If you build up 3 questions, otherwise we run out of time.
Okay, well, do you want to come to the next person and we'll try and answer questions all together? I have a gentleman here.
Good afternoon.
You're full of good
Thank you
ideas.
so much for your speech. It's very enlightening to be here today. I have a question for Mrs. Assange. You said rightfully that the internet and the press were at their freest in 2010 and 2011. As time goes on, we see topics like cancel culture and people being fired or ostracized for their political views, for their political statements, or for their political supports, especially on social media. And do you believe that we're continuously moving towards a media based on censorship? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any other questions at the moment? Yeah, one question here, and then we'll come back and we'll answer that question in a group.
Yeah, good afternoon. Thank you for being here with us today. I have a question. I think you are aware of the case of Navalny in Russia. And actually in Russia, Navalny is called like Russian Julian Assange. And I mean, we can understand why it happens like this. And actually, I think that the United States, the Great Britain, and all other countries, they're actually claiming that Navalny should be freed, and it's their like position. So my question is, do you think, do you consider that this case, I mean Navalny, and Julian's case are similar, I would say? What's your opinion on this?
Thank you very much. So if we have 1, 2, 3 questions there, if any of you want to come back on any of those.
Buongiorno, good morning.
Is that working?
Yeah. I want to say that...
In the first place, of course, it's pursuant upon us to involve ourselves in the policy formulation and administration of our states. And consequently, if we don't, then we end up as a client government, as you can see in the United States at the moment, where 2 people, Jake Sullivan and Victoria Nuland, run the government, run the foreign affairs of that government. The next one is that, yes, there is worldwide. So in 2010, the internet was described by the legacy newspapers as a disruptive emergence. It disrupted the means of distributing knowledge and, as a consequence, the flow of power. Because in democracies, they get us to do what they wish through the logos, the word, through publications. So with the internet, we were able to begin to get an understanding of the exercise of power and also to make contribution to policy formulation. Slowly over the years, power has found ways to reassert itself. But that assertion or reassertion has resulted in fractured societies, as you see in Europe, in every country. So, including us back into governance by listening to us, by us having with each other, with our friends, conversations over a barbecue or a beer or a glass of wine or coffee, to formulate knowledge, to turn information through discussion into knowledge. And the body of knowledge flows into governance and administration. Really important, simple things like that. And the third question I'll leave to somebody else, but I think that those 2 polls include the third question. Where we'll go from here, well, there's something about the future that it's very hard to predict,
Thanks for those. Sorry? I think that I've definitely seen a lot of engagement with Julian's case in recent years, and I think that's because there have been such shocks to the understanding of citizenship. The COVID period obviously was a real period of I'd like to say renegotiation, but it wasn't really a negotiation. A change of the citizens' relationship to the state. And I think that was also a wake-up call for many, which has politicized people because they understand their rights are not just a theory to assert, but it needs to be backed by, well, basically that there's a coercive element to this state's will to enforce your rights or not. And so I think the average person, wherever they stood on the debate around COVID, spent a lot more time thinking about these things. So I think definitely that period has shifted people's awareness and engagement, and understood that the real life day-to-day consequences of how policy is formulated, whether it's legitimate, whether it's backed by popular support or not. And I don't know the specifics of Switzerland, but I see this more generally. And obviously that also spilled over into the social media and social media censorship. And it's not just the censorship per se, but certain tools were developed and implemented during this period and standardized, as in it became normal to censor regular people if they had an unpopular opinion, right or wrong, you know. Wrong information was considered to be dangerous, and this gave a license to silence people or to remove their ability to speak online. So that's another aspect to why people have become more politicized. So, you know, a lot of people, even if they weren't censored, they were annoyed that they couldn't read opinions that perhaps they disagreed with, that they weren't even allowed to sample different opinions or contradict an opinion that they didn't like, that this was removed from them. And of course this policing of speech, I think, has really made people aware that our freedom to speak is fragile and is being undermined and is being decided by people that we don't necessarily agree with, and that's a really big problem. So to the question of whether we're moving to a media that's based on censorship, I mean, it depends what media. Certainly, for the big media houses, what has motivated them to come out in support of Julian has been, I think, partly the complete outrage and obvious injustice that this situation has become clear to the general public, to their readers, and so on. So there's a pressure for the big media to recognize this. but also there is self-interest. And that's why you see The Guardian and the New York Times and the Washington Post from quite early on putting out editorials saying this case should be dropped because it is based on it is an attack on the press, on the freedom of the press. It is setting a precedent that can be used against the rest of the press. That means that there's quite a profound understanding of the legal implications of the case. That's good. They have their own legal department, so presumably they have their lawyers having looked at the actual indictment and understanding the implications and how it isn't just dangerous, it's basically already setting a chill in the press. And therefore, yes, it is a press based on censorship because they're not printing everything they could print because it's too dangerous while Julian, because of Julian's indictment and imprisonment. It's too dangerous. So the press doesn't want to publish. But at the same time, there's also been an emergence of alternative press, alternative voices who are, supported by their readers. And you have the most recognizable investigative journalists like Seymour Hersh and so on, just writing directly for his readers. And, I imagine doing pretty well without having to bow to censorship and so on.
I think that covers the first two questions.
Yeah.
Do you see any parallels with Russia?
Well, I think, look, Navalny is, I interpret Navalny's arrest as a publisher because it was actually when he started revealing the corruption and so on, not so much for his, as an opposition figure, because I don't think his party had a numerical challenge. What was really a challenge to the Russian state was his revelations about corruption, and that's what ultimately, I think, pressed them on to prosecute him. Clearly, he's a political prisoner, and I think Julian's arrest has made it much easier to have political prisoners. It's just become normalized since Julian's arrest to arrest dissidents and keep them in prison. So I think there's,
Thank you. Gabriel, did you want to add anything, or do you want me to go on to the next questions?
No, I think you've covered it all very much.
Okay, well, I'll come to you next then. We'll have the next question, if you could.
Thank you. Good morning. I'm Italian, and even for me, it's important to have my language because if I'm not able to understand really well English, it's better to have any content in my languages. And I want to offer to you an opportunity. We can host and translate any of your content in more than one language, even 20 languages for every content, in using a platform called Aluga, using the EA or Real Translator. And it's a pleasure for the company to host your content and help you and Julian in the future too.
Thank you. That's very interesting, actually. No, and I'm sure that will be taken up upon. Certainly, an interesting point, because last year that point really didn't come up last year, I have to say, but it has come up this year. Any other questions of the moment?
Grazie.
Please, down the front here.
Buongiorno, ciao a tutti. La mia non vuole essere una domanda, ma vuole essere una call to action a tutte le persone che sono qui oggi.
So it's not a question, it's a call to action.
Sì, Allora, spero di non emozionarmi perché...
No, non si preoccupa, avanti, avanti.
Allora, io faccio parte di un gruppo che si chiama Como for Assange e ci sono qui dei miei amici.
Ok, un attimo.
Sì.
Okay, I'm part of a Free Assange group. All sitting here in front. Okay.
Non so se tutti sapete, siamo in grande attesa del giorno X, che è il giorno in cui Julian Assange, in cui la giurisdizione inglese potrebbe decidere se estradarlo oppure di concedere alla famiglia nuovamente di appellarsi contro questa decisione allucinante, perché non ci si può pensare che lui venga trasferito in America per 175 anni.
Okay, she basically says that they dream of a day when Julian is released and doesn't have to fear the removal to the United States on these scandalous charges and the potential prison sentence which he could face.
Quindi quello che vorrei dire oggi è invito tutti voi veramente a fare in modo di far conoscere il caso di Julian Assange a tutte le persone che conoscete e soprattutto un invito a un'azione fondamentale. Sapremo del giorno X magari anche solo 2 giorni prima, non si sa ancora una data. Vado avanti.
Basically, this is the call of action that everyone should inform themselves about Julian Assange's case, become interested in it, and then...
E quindi invito a seguire il canale Instagram o Twitter di Stella Assange. C'è un tool che si chiama, adesso esatto perché www.freeassangeemergencytoolkit.com e invito tutti ad andare a Milano in Piazza del Liberty o a Roma o a Catania o a Palermo. Comunque seguite il canale di Stella oppure i nostri canali Como for Assange o Comitato per la Liberazione Julian Assange Italia, che è di Milano. Tutti noi dobbiamo essere sotto all'ambasciata il giorno X, perché non esiste che Julian Assange venga estradato in America. Io lo dico sempre, io non voglio vivere in un mondo in cui Julian Assange muore in prigione.
Okay, I will translate. This is an invite for people to follow the Instagram, Stella's Instagram and the social media, to become involved, to go into the piazzas to protest, because she thinks it will be a fundamental disgrace if Julian Assange were to be allowed to stay and then potentially die in prison.
Julian Assange deve essere liberato ed è nostro dovere pretenderlo.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you for that. Right, any other questions? Right down the back there's a question. How's his health? Okay, how is his health?
Well, it's deteriorating. He's been in a small cell for 4.5 years, and he had a mini stroke in October 2021, maybe 2021, and he is taking medication for that. But obviously, it can only get worse under these conditions. And yeah, I mean, I can't, I don't want to.
Well, that's very, very difficult for you. We understand.
It's his privacy as well,
Yeah, of course. Let me ask a question then. you're saying, talking about last sort of 5 years, since, you know, the last 5 years have been tumultuous. We've had COVID, we have now regional conflicts. The world seems to be separating into American sphere, Chinese sphere, Russian sphere. The world is not in a good place at the moment, okay? And maybe this is one for Gabriel here. Do you ever think that Julian's case is kind of, you know, impacted by this more sort of global development? Do you think that actually his case has been hindered, maybe what's happened in the last few years, say through COVID or through some of the geopolitics?
Oh yeah, well, you know, there's always these huge issues on the table all the time, and that's what, you know, the campaign is always pushing up against that and fighting for attention with these huge issues that will impact us all for the rest of our lives. But you know, what's happening to Julian and the example that has been set really, you know, flows in to all of these issues. It's, you know, it's our right to know, you know, what our governments do in our name, that is at stake with Julian's case. And so it sort of has this flow on into all of these aspects, you know, that the powerful are trying to, you know, split the globe, or whether it's, you know, information about the pandemic, or whether it's information about the, you know, the wars that are happening in the Middle East or in the Ukraine. This is all impacted by what is happening to Julian. So in a sense, yes, it's distracting, but if we were able to probably educate ourselves on these very, very important questions that affect us all and our children, then we might be able to make different or better decisions in that sense. So always trying to bring it back to really what's at stake in Julian's case.
Well, thank you. Are there any final questions? Any final question? Well, down the back, and then we will come to you, don't worry. Down the back, please.
Hello, thank you. Thank you for being here and sharing all of this information. I'd like to know, here we are at a Bitcoin conference. WikiLeaks and Bitcoin were very much together back in the early days. Satoshi even said it's too soon, we've kicked the hornet's nest. I'd love to see it come full circle, and we have a president candidate running in the US now on a Bitcoin kind of standard, Robert F. Kennedy. If he were to get in as president, how does it work? Can he lift the extradition, and would Julian be freed?
Kennedy said he'd pardon Julian on day one of his presidency. Yeah, so that's his policy position, so that if he becomes president, he could pardon Julian. Doesn't matter if he was, you know, it doesn't matter if he's been convicted or not. He can do a pardon. There's other candidates as well who have that position. Marianne Williamson, a progressive Democrat, has the same position, as well as Vivek Ramaswamy, a Republican candidate as well. So, and Cornel West, the Green candidate. So you've got, you know, it's not a losing position to pardon Julian Assange, and I think you're seeing that by all of these candidates taking it up, because they know it's a vote winner. And that people want Julian out, and so they'll pardon him.
Thank you. Let's hope our Bitcoiners in the US can vote in the right people. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your question. We have a question down here from one of the Free Assange members. Please.
Thank you. Thank you for coming here. It's a very honor to have you in Lugano. And my question is, we have a lot of young people here who are attending university, and they are studying for journalism, and I remember my first day in school, in university. People said as you have to change the world, but for you, according to you, what does mean changing the world? And what is your message to young people who are studying and they are preparing themselves for the world?
Thank you. An excellent question, I think. So let's go to the young at heart.
Life has so many ups and downs that you have to be pretty outrageous to give advice to young people. But Article 26 of the Universal Declaration has 3 parts. It says the right to knowledge. I think defending that right and embracing that right is fundamental. Grab hold of it, defend it, take it to your bosom, take it to your breast. That's all I would say.
Thank you, John. Stella?
Well, I'd say, yes, we need the world to change. That's an ongoing project. We need to keep changing it, because even when you make, when you win, there's always going to be pushback, and you have to be ready and meet that challenge. It's an ongoing fight, and it's actually, you're looking into the future, but you should also learn from the past. That the same struggle that Julian and we and you are involved in for justice, for truth, is actually a very old struggle as well. And we take on that mantle. Each generation takes on that mantle to fight for what's right and to have a conscience and to see that we each play a role in the world that we live in. And if we don't play a role, then we are at the mercy of other forces. And what we have emerging now is a completely new power structure with new tools to harm our ability, our autonomy, our ability to express ourselves, our ability to defend ourselves and defend others. And so those new tools need to be met with new forms of moral, technical, political resistance. And I think it's also a responsibility. It's not just an optimistic, clear-eyed look into the future, but it's also a responsibility. It comes at a cost, but there are rewards, and the rewards are individual but also collective.
I'll just don't be afraid, I think is my short and sweet message for everyone.
That is indeed short and sweet. Thank you very, very much. Any final questions? Yes, please. Here.
Thank you very much. It's not even a question, it's more a sign of gratitude, because while you were talking about it, I remembered about secondary school times in Ukraine. We have an anti-corruption bureau, and they were organizing the schools against corruption based on the platform of WikiLeaks. And throughout the 2 weeks of this extracurricular activity, we were learning how to deal with the. We had a significant level of corruption in those years, and throughout materials published there, we could draft schemes of investigations, some particular documents, and it has formed a lot our mentality and position. And thank you very much for the platform itself. Thank you to what you are doing and bringing forward this idea of justice. Thank you.
Okay, any final questions? It's coming up to 5 o'clock, so we've been going an hour and a half, which I think, and it's flown by. To be honest, it's gone so quickly, which is always a good sign. Perhaps I could then, if there's no more questions, perhaps I can ask then our distinguished guests to perhaps wrap up and make a final statement. Who would like to start?
No, I have to get Matthew to translate this.
Okay.
From here, once more we emerge to see the stars.
To see the stars?
The last line of Dante.
Oh, Dante's Inferno, is it?
From here,
yeah.
once more we emerge to see the stars.
Well, io non metto in lingua italiana di Dante, però da qui usciamo per guardare verso le stelle. Stelle, sì, esatto, per vedere le stelle. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll just say a quick thank you so much, Matthew, for hosting us again.
It's my pleasure.
And yeah, make sure everybody follow Stella on Twitter or myself, and just stay up to date with what's going on. Keep yourself informed with good information and pass that on to others. Always keep talking about these sort of issues. Yeah, and thank you, everyone.
I think that it's important to, not be despondent or feel defeated. The fact that they imprisoned Julian is actually a sign that WikiLeaks won, that WikiLeaks transformed the world, and Julian's freedom is within reach, and we need to push. We need to educate. We need to speak to friends, family. Keep pushing, because it really is within reach, and I genuinely believe that. And Julian is still as brilliant and wonderful as he always has been. It's a struggle, he's suffering, but he's there. And I just, the world needs Julian's voice. We just yesterday there was some news that Julian had signed a declaration on free speech. It's called the Westminster Declaration. You can read westminsterdeclaration.org. Almost 140 people, academics, journalists, and so on, signed it. And the idea is that it is a global declaration for free speech. And I think it's the time is coming for a pushback on free speech, and Julian is at the forefront of that. And even his imprisonment has become a symbol of the censorship and the general censorship. The world understands that his imprisonment is part of an evil that affects us all. So we all need to make sure that Julian is freed. and that the world knows and understands that his freedom is tied up with all our freedoms.
So let me just say a few thank yous before we finally depart. Obviously, first and foremost, my thanks to Stella, to John, to Gabriel. It is great to see you again. Do send our very best wishes to Julian and from Lugano, and you know, we send you our very best wishes as a family, and as obviously some very fundamental issues which you're fighting for. Let me thank the Forum B, who have organised this two-day conference, and from my own part, Elena Macchiori from the Living Lab of Lugano, the Living Lab. Thank you, Elena. Fantastic job also with the microphones. Give a round of applause to Elena. My participation has only been possible because my wonderful students are here today, and it's not a scheduled day for lecture. Tomorrow, I'm seeing you tomorrow. We have another guest tomorrow, but I really do appreciate you coming down, almost all of you, to attend today. You do me proud. You do the university proud to come and listen to what I think are very, very important issues. And as I said, you know, part of the freedom of speech is the freedom to disagree, okay? And, you know, whether you actually agree wholeheartedly or whether you have disagreements, okay, the issue is that you're allowed to air them, okay? So thank you very much to my students. To the dedicated Free Assange group here, wonderful. And to the rest of the audience, vi ringraziamo moltissimo. Ovviamente la prossima volta facciamo in 2 lingue, credo. Sarebbe meglio per capire anche per voi. I just said that next time we'll do it in 2 languages, so that there's fuller understanding. So thank you very, very much, everyone. Thank you, and have a good evening. Buona serata.
Grazie mille. Palco 21 continua domani ore 9 e anche sabato in italiano.